Sure, why not? How do you feel about potentially regionalizing the school district with Thomaston?
Is that good? In terms of regionalizing with Thomaston in particular, I think there are things to be gained and there are things that you lose when you regionalize. So initially you look at it and consider the needs of our particular school system. One in particular, I would say, is probably greater attention and greater depth in our special education services. And I'm aware that in some ways Thomaston has some strength in that area. In the question of general regionalization, I'm originally from Baltimore, where we don't have town-based systems. What we have there are, I went to Baltimore County Public Schools, and so there you see many schools in a large region that get the benefit of essentially a central office that is running the entire district. So you end up with cost savings and leverage in terms of curriculum and personnel and so forth. So whether or not that's even an option, I mean, it sounds like, several years ago we had discussed it and it didn't pass, and I know fairly recently there was discussion about that with our former superintendent. Whether there are things to be gained from that, I think there's no question, there are. However, whether it's a realistic idea at this point is, it's unclear. Do I think that we should always be leveraging and doing what we can to save costs and to use our resources in the best way? Absolutely. I think that's very important.
Yeah, as I understand this, as Ellen mentioned, that this was brought up with Thomaston several years ago and it fell through for whatever reason. I don't know the particulars of it, but I think overall it is a good idea in limited format. Again, Ellen brought up special ed, and I think that's an area. I think curriculum would be another area. I mean, we're housing between Bristol and Thomaston, and for a enrollment size that we have here, I think we need to question whether we need a curriculum director that we're paying 6 figures for, and maybe we can bridge the gap between some of the towns around us to look at, again, we need to look at, somebody maybe needs to look at Thomaston and talk to them, because I took a look at their budget, and their enrollment is only a few hundred children less than ours, and they're operating on a budget of $8 to $10 million less than we are. So they're doing something right. But as on the whole, I think it is a good idea. But again, I think it's got to be a piecemeal. It's not just going to be a whole regionalization thing. I don't think there's any need for that. Thank you.
How do you fit within the qualifications as a potential candidate for the BOE?
As a candidate, I have a fairly varied background. I began my career with a bachelor's in English, and I started in management consulting, actually. So I spent a great deal of time working in the corporate world, and I was particularly working in federal government. I worked for the Department of Education to a limited extent, wrote policy for for NIST and for Department of Homeland Security and various things like that. So I learned a lot about how the federal government works, and I had an interest in politics in general, and recently engaged in more local types of efforts. Beyond that, I'm an educator now, so I went from being a management consultant to going into the education field because I really wanted to be there. And I can tell you that I really wanted to be there because you lose a lot when you go from the the business world, and you decide that you're going to take a form of employment that it's a helping profession, which we know is not generally the way to make the most money in the world. So, so anyway, when I came into education, my personal aims were towards educational equity and justice. I went through the Teach for America program and learned a lot about the achievement gap. And, I'm very well aware that Connecticut has one of the greatest achievement gaps, if not the greatest, in the entire nation, which is scary and frankly deplorable given our resources here. So that's something that I've been very engaged in, and I'm not sure that those issues are limited to urban areas. I don't think that they are. I think here in town, we could do a lot to focus on our graduation rate and the degree to which people know where they're going after they finish their studies in our school system. So, 1 minute? Okay, so currently I'm a special educator, which gives me a lot of range in terms of educational policy, legal issues, and so forth. And, I know the business, and I have kids in the system, I intend to keep them in the system, and there's nothing more important to me than investment in our community, and really getting involved to my best capacity, which I feel is Board of Education.
Okay, so first off, I'm not a politician. This is my first time running for public office. I'm not a professional educator. However, I am dedicated. Anybody who pays attention to the Board of Ed here can attest that I've been at just about every Board of Ed meeting for the past 2 years in this town. I've always had an interest in education, and especially more of a concern in watching it devolve over the years and decades with every federal attempt to fix education. One of the worst was No Child Left Behind. We saw what a disaster that was. And universally, it was unliked. And that failed, so what do? We come up with another idea, and we bring us the Common Core standards, which, having a vested interest in 3 children in the system, I started delving into that and looking at, who was behind it, who wrote the standards, who didn't write the standards and should have, who stood to benefit the most from it. And I tell you, it's not the children. So with these concerns, I started, for the past couple of years, going to each of the Board of Ed meetings and explaining my concerns and giving them the research I found and the problems I had with it. So I'm dedicated when I'm given a project or something to work on. I'm devoted, I'm factual, and one thing I have to say is, and this doesn't come from me, is passionate. I've had more than several people come up to me at meetings and say, Chris, I don't necessarily agree with everything you say or see eye to eye on this one particular topic, but your passion really reads through. You do your homework, you come in here, you stand behind what you stand for.
1 minute.
Thank you. And and for that, I respect you and I support you. Well, that's a win right there. I mean, I can't ask for any more than that. I don't need to see eye to eye with somebody. If we can have an adult conversation, come to the common ground, what is best for the children, and that's almost become a cliche these days, but that's what this board is for, to do what's best for the children. So like I said, I'm not a politician, I'm not a professional educator. I am what I like to call, I am what I like to call a first response educator. I'm a parent, okay? I don't have the job of not to denounce anybody, but 8 to 4 teaching, Monday through Friday. As a parent, we do this 365 indefinitely, right? So I feel those qualifications, I think, qualifies me to be on this board. Thank you.
Do you think a question and answer section should be added to your agenda?
So the Board of Education meeting agenda. Question and answer answer, I think, is something that we should all be open to all the time. I mean, that's what we would do as candidates, as elected people. Your job is to do question and answer all the time and inquire with people and see, what are your thoughts? Because quite frankly, you're not there to represent simply your own views. You're there to accomplish the job of being a public servant, which is much broader than that. Question and answer, I'm certainly open to. I think fundamentally, one of the things that we need to consider in our town is how to get people engaged with the issues they care about on a more ongoing basis. For example, and I'm sure many of you have seen this, how you will see a gigantic public comment, like ours, if it's something that feels very personal to someone, and usually that's when it hits right home, like the issue with busing people or budget issues and so forth. What would be great is if we had that more on an ongoing basis, and that's what I'd really like to see. I'd like to see more people talking about what's going on in our town, and whether that's an issue of not having that information or the accessibility of the elected officials, or whether that's communication systems we need to put in place. To me, that's the fundamental issue. Question and answer should be happening all the time.
Okay, so as I mentioned before, I've been at quite a few Board of Ed meetings over the past couple of years. And on top of that, Town Council, Board of Finance, Police Commission, and various boards. And I can tell you that currently the way the Board of Ed is run is the most public aggressive board I've seen in this town. I mean, when you start an agenda under public comment that says boards do not comment on public comment, gee, you wonder why me and Melanie are the only people that show up at these Board of Ed meetings. I've seen people ask, I've seen people ask very simple questions, me myself, ask very simple questions, and the board just sits there and looks at you. This isn't a legal thing, it just answer the question. We're not talking hour-long special meetings and stuff. These are simple questions. Now, the Board of Ed agendas are atrociously long to begin with, so adding another section on there for question and answer, I could see maybe at the end having a brief question and answer or public comment on non-agenda items where the board members are allowed to answer. But I just don't like how they run their board, and I've told them that. Any other town meeting that you go to, they have public comment, and generally if somebody on the board, they'll engage you in not a dialogue or a debate, it's just they'll answer your question. And I don't see why, when you're dealing with, especially the education, when you're dealing with parents predominantly, and teachers, anybody related to kids, how you can be so disassociated with these people coming up to the podium with some very sensitive issues at times. And even if you don't want to answer in public, at least make the effort to get back to them. And if I'm elected on this board, I will do that. If somebody asks a question, if I don't know the answer that night, I'll find it, I'll get back to you. Thank you.
Are you for or against Common Core, and why?
3 minutes.
Okay, here we go. All right, so Common Core. Obviously as an educator, I've had the experience of working with the Common Core to some extent. And while it has its advantages and disadvantages, I have to tell you, overall, as an educator on the ground, it's not quite as scary as it appears. Now, if you really look at it what it is, it's a set of standards that are normal. I mean, honestly, they're pretty much normal. They require you to teach certain things. They require you to attend to certain standards of education, certain standards in math, certain standards in English language arts. Why is that important? Because what you don't want are people in the classrooms, one person is here in the English classroom across town, they're somewhere else, and it's completely disconnected. You definitely don't want that because you want some continuity in what students are learning. So we've been standards driven for a very long time. I think some of the discomfort with it comes from the funding issues and how that works. quite literally, to be able to say, you know what, I reject the Common Core outright is a very difficult thing to do. You can do that individually. You can say, you know, I'm not going to have my child test, which is okay. But for us as a town to literally opt out of it would be almost impossible. I had an opportunity to look at the numbers, and we get, out of grant funding for education, we get 10.6 million. I don't believe that we have the resources to make that up, honestly. So federal makes up very little of how we pay the education expenses, 8.6% approximately. State gives us about 45.6. So when you have rising education costs at the local level, you just can't afford to take away the Common Core. What I do think that we should do is look to work within the system. So make adjustments, work with it, leverage the curriculum that we can. But I do believe it's always important to look at what it really is and see if it's what it's made out to be, because I'm not sure that the Common Core is necessarily a bad thing, and it does ensure some level of accountability that you want as a taxpayer.
Okay, so the short answer would be no, I don't like them. But why? Well, I don't think we have enough time tonight to deal with that, but I mean, there's a myriad of reasons. One, it really doesn't have even a right to exist. We're a local control state, and Alan brought up the funding, and the way this was more or less bribed to the states to adopt these standards. Sight unseen. I don't want my children's entire education experience to be an experiment. You know, No Child Left Behind was the perfect solution. Well, not so much. Then we incorporate this, and we gotta go another 10 years to find out this doesn't work. The other big piece is we didn't get to change anything. You know, I have a study that was done by PISA, Program for International Assessments, done in 2013 before we adopted the Common Core. And just to sum up the study in one paragraph, that it stated, quote, only 4 education systems in the world outperformed Connecticut in reading. Only 7 systems did statistically better in science. In math, students performed on average with their international peers, but performed above average nationally. So why did we change? Yes, some of the Connecticut standards were a little bit outdated. When I was up at the LOB a couple of years ago, the CMTs, yes, they're outdated. I'm not a fan of standardized tests either, but one of the legislatures asked one of the department heads of the State Department of Ed why we haven't changed our CMT tests in 30 years. You know, we could have maybe fine-tuned some things instead of going through this whole uproot, and we hear, you know, from the teachers, a lot of the big problem was the implementation. It's a mess. And you know, I don't think it's fair to our kids to be living through this. You know, I've seen the standards, I've taken the sample tests.
1 minute?
Yeah, I know. All right, so, you know, and the thing is, the proof in the pudding on this, was, you know, 2 years ago we went through SBAC as a sample run. This past one was the actual test. We come back and find out across the board the scores are down. Now, the excuse is that it's all new and this. I mean, how many excuses do we need to keep doing this? Now, as far as pulling out, Ellen has a lot of good points there, but I certainly don't have time for
30 seconds.
All right.
What is your position in regards to separating the Board of Ed budget from the town budget at referendum time?
I can tell from that room, this is a hot topic too. Okay. So I think it depends on what you're trying to accomplish with that. If you're looking to, there are advantages to it. Right, so if you do that, you have greater transparency, which is a wonderful thing, because you want to be able to see where the money is going. You want to see what is being proposed and against what line items. So you get granularity, you get transparency, all good things. And I think that allows the public to give greater input at a more focused level, which is good. What concerns me about it, honestly, is I believe there's a tendency to develop like an us and them type mentality about those who are consumers of the school system, you know, people who have kids in the school system, and people who don't sometimes. That's not to say that, you know, there aren't people that are generally invested in public education that support it either way. But I just am not sure that at this point we need a lot of opportunity for division in our town. What I think would be the best possible solution is to have greater cooperation and transparency across the board. That to me is the ultimate solution. Now, I know from reading reports on this, looking at the Hebron report in particular, that what it doesn't do is decrease spending necessarily, and it requires a lot. Now, what we do have, if the concern is regarding education spending in general and how that works, the state's going in the direction of allowing greater control at the local level in terms of how funding works. It used to be that you couldn't decrease your overall budget by, 0.5% lower. You couldn't do that without having an impact at the state level. They give you a 2-to-1 kind of penalty. At this point, you have greater control. 1 minute. So as enrollment is going down, which it is across the state, what we're currently looking at the state level is allowing for more like a 3% adjustment without something coming back on you. So I think before we would move to something like that, we might want to look at another cycle of the budget and see how all of that current thinking about education budgeting in general pans out, and to what degree people feel that they have control. Because I'd really like to increase collaboration overall.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add than that. Ellen brought up the Hebron study, which I also looked at, and ultimately one of the key findings was that basically there was no benefit on either side of it. I personally thought it was a good idea going through the whole budget season, and practically everybody got up to the podium and said, support the budget for the Board of Ed. Don't steal from the kids. You know, so. You know, in that respect, I thought it was a good idea, but after reading this report, again, they stated that there was no benefit on the towns that actually had it. Well, one, I don't remember the town exactly, but they basically, because this takes a charter revision to do it, it's not exactly this flip of a switch. It's not easy to do. So if this doesn't, if the bifurcation goes through and we make this change, and then a year or two cycles go by, and there's an oops. Well, now you're looking at another 18-month charter revision. So one town, what they did is they had flipping of the switch. They had an option in the charter to implement this if needed. So they couldn't get the cooperation, you know, between members of the town. They could try this other option. I would be all for that. If we're going to open up the charter, which I've pretty much heard universally that everyone wants to do, I certainly want to do it. It's been long overdue to be done. I would definitely go for this. Ralph mentioned something about a recall position. That's how I would look at this. If it doesn't work, we try it the other way. Thank you.